All right, we are live.
Welcome, everybody. Tune in here. We have our great host, Bruce Eckfeld. We're going to be talking today a little bit about, your flywheel. And I was just speaking with Bruce about it a little bit before is, how do you maintain momentum once you get things off the ground and continue growth? And, how do you rely on your core values and make sure that you're sustaining your core values as you're building momentum as a business and as you are scaling. So just quick introduction about my company, Founder Shield. I'll be your host today, Eric Schneider. I'm a VP of sales at Founder Shield. We are a insurance brokerage that focuses on specifically emerging business lines and emerging industries and helping them build out their insurance programs really from the ground up, working with pre-revenue companies all the way to companies, IPOing. So can definitely relate to Bruce's sentiment on, it's definitely difficult and, sometimes challenging for founders when they are looking to continue momentum and grow and scale. So really interested today to hear what Bruce has to say. And obviously he has a lot of experience, both as a consultant and as a founder himself. So I'll kick it to you, Bruce.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Eric. So so today is really, it's about how to find the core momentum inside your business. And this is key, particularly in times of change, as you're figuring out strategy, as you're figuring out where the new opportunities are, to really kind of go back and reinforce those core activities, something we call flywheel. So this comes out of Jim Collins. We'll talk a little bit about how he came up with that and the work, but we're going to talk about the flywheel. We're going to talk about how to find your flywheel, and we're going to talk about how you can use it to make better business decisions. So just a couple of housekeeping. So I've got my chat open here. At any point today, if you've got a question, throw it into chat. I'll try to watch it as I go. I'll try to address things that are kind of topical as we go. Anything that I don't cover as we go, I'll make sure that we've got some Q&A time at the end here. We can cover it then. So please use the chat. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we can get into. Perfect. Awesome. All right. So if looks like everyone can see my screen, I'm just going to move this over here so I can see the full screen. So I call it spinning your flywheel. How do we create momentum in the business? And you're going to do that by focusing on key activities. Do it like that. So we're going to cover a couple things. So one, what is a flywheel? What is this concept? What does it mean? How do we use it? How do we discover your key activities? What are the key activities that stitch together to create momentum inside your business? And then how do we connect them to interlink? How do we map it out? And then how do we use it to create organizational focus? So as Eric mentioned, I'm a business coach, I'm a business advisor. I work with companies on how to grow and scale. This is one of the core concepts that I use. And it's a core concept because it tells me what is the core activities inside of a business that we can leverage to grow the business, scale the business faster, easier, less effort, less resources, less capital. And if we can get this right and we can articulate this, it really makes the whole process simple. It's also a tool that I use to sort of diagnose existing businesses. So when I'm coming in and working with a business, if we have a flywheel, we can use it to as a diagnostic. If we don't have a flywheel, we can build a flywheel and kind of understand what's working in the business, what's not working in the business, where do we need to create focus. Oftentimes, when I see a business struggling or faltering, it is because one or more activities within inside their flywheel is not running optimally, is not doing its job. And unless we get all these activities working well together, we're not going to see that natural business momentum. So particularly in these kind of cases where the landscapes change, competitors change, customers' needs have changed, oftentimes what is happening or the result is that the flywheel becomes unstable or unbalanced, and we need to kind of go back and shore things up a little bit. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Whoops, there we go. So I'm a founder and a CEO. So I had a technology company I founded back in 2002. Spent about 10 years in the technology world, working with companies on fairly complex business systems. I was a lean, agile expert focusing on application of Lean Agile in the software space, and then ultimately in business operations and business strategy. We are 241st fastest growing company in 2009. I'm certified scaling up and 3HAG, which is another strategic framework that I use. I'm kind of a crazy adventure guy, so I've done all sorts of climbing Kilimanjaro. I've done an Ironman, dove the Coral Sea. So I'm big on setting big, crazy goals and figuring out how to achieve them over time. I'm also 0.75% titanium by weight. So those crazy events have caused me some damage over time. So I also know what it's like to recover. I think a lot of companies are kind of dealing with recovery right now, but I know what that's like, both from a mindset and a practical point of view. And then I run 2 podcasts, one called Scaling Up Services, which is all about service-based businesses. And then Thinking Outside the Bud is all about cannabis, the business of cannabis. And then I'm a father of 4, and I'm based in New York City. So that's just a little bit about me. So I've been there. I've been in that CEO seat. I know what it's like to have to make the tough decisions, to have to figure out strategy, how to grow and scale. So how do you get the most out of this session? Couple suggestions. We're recording this, so you can always go back and rewatch it if you want to get into detail. So you don't need to take copious notes. Look for 1 or 2 things at this level. Just 1 or 2 things you want to try. And I always use a phrase, bias towards action. What can you apply? What can you actually take into the process, take into the business, and figure out how can you apply these things? That is where you're going to learn. Stay open to new ideas. So to the extent that I say things today that either are unfamiliar or maybe contradictory to other things, try it, experiment. I encourage you to, it's an opportunity to investigate some new opportunities, new chance, or new way of doing things. Try some things, run some experiments. That is the best way to learn. Like I said, we're recording this so you can rewatch, go deeper. This is my email address. If you have any questions that come up today, feel free to contact me, and I've got contact information at the end as well. There may be something that I didn't explain perfectly, or you have particular situations you'd like to talk through. I'd be happy to do that. So as I mentioned, Flywheel comes from Jim Collins. He originally wrote about it in Good to Great. And then he recently published I think it was about a year ago, 2 years ago, a monograph. And I got to give him credit. This was, he basically took a couple of pages of his book, republished it, wrapped it with some new copy, republished it as a monograph for $10, $9.99 or something like that, and has sold I think a couple 100,000 copies at this point. So brilliant strategic moves. But it's a great book. It does dig into it a little more in a little more specificity. When I'm working with clients, I have them read the monograph. It's like 30 pages. It's not that long. So if you really want to get into it, this is a great short read on the flywheel concept and Jim's kind of take on it and why he kind of came up with the idea and how he's seen it applied. So, and that's what we're talking about today, is this concept of flywheel. So what is a flywheel? So a flywheel is a set of activities, a set of core activities that work together in a particular sequence to build momentum in the business. And the idea is that if you can get these activities right, working well, there's a natural positive reinforcing cycle in it. And if anyone out there has been on a spin cycle, they are hard to get going, meaning when you clip into a spin cycle and you start the process, there's some resistance there, right? It takes a little effort to get it going, to get that weight in the back wheel going. But once you get it going, it has this natural momentum. It wants to keep going. In fact, it can be difficult to stop. And I've seen accidents happen where people get thrown off bikes because they don't realize that the flywheel's in play. And that is really the concept. And the same thing happens in business. Once we get this flywheel going, there's a natural momentum to push forward. Now, it's also tough to start, right? It can take some effort. You have to push into it a little bit to get it going. But once you do, it will create momentum. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that core set of activities. So generally what I find is it's 4 to 7 core activities, things that you do that stitch together in a particular sequence that are connected, meaning step A does something that is the beginning of step B, and the end of step B is something that is the beginning of step C. They kind of naturally stitch together and they flow and they work together as a system. And there's a positive feedback loop, meaning when I get to the last step, the end of the last step is now the input for the top step, for the first step. And that positive feedback loop, what builds that momentum over time. And like I said, it can take a little work to get it going, but once it starts to go, there's a natural tendency for it to increase in momentum. That's what we're looking for. So let's do a couple examples so you kind of get the concept. So I'm going to start with Amazon. What is Amazon's flywheels? So uh, 5 basic steps in how Amazon has built their business from a flywheel point of view. We always put the thing that you can kind of start with, the area where you can kind of push on in the beginning at the top. So they start with low prices on lots of items, right? So by having low prices on lots of items, right, that's the first stage of the flywheel. It increases customer visits. It draws customers in, right? So low prices, lots of items means more customers are going to come into the system, into the network. Once I've lost the customers into the network, I can attract third-party sellers, right? So once I have audience, I have customers coming to my site, I can go to third-party sellers and say, hey, look, I have audience. I have people that are looking to buy things. You have things you want to sell. Come in and be a third-party seller on Amazon. Once I've got third-party sellers, I can expand and extend distribution, right? I now have volume, right? I've got lots of customers. I've got lots of sellers. I'm going to increase the transactions. That means I can extend my distribution capabilities. That expanding the store and extending the distribution capabilities allows me to grow my revenues on lower fixed cost, right? So by having a large distribution, my ability to generate revenue is easier and easier over time. That additional revenue with low fixed costs is going to allow me to offer more low prices on more items, right? So we have now completed one turn of the flywheel, and now that reinforces, right? That allows me to increase my customers, increase it, attract third-party sellers, more distribution, better revenues on fixed costs. Then it allows it more items at low price. All right, so this is the Amazon flywheel, and the idea here is that each of these has to work well in sequence for the system to work. If I fail to attract third-party sellers, the flywheel's not going to work, right? If I lose that segment, if I lose that part of the flywheel, it's going to cause me to then make it difficult to expand the store, which is going to decrease my revenues, right? So I'm going to have a negative feedback loop. So I need to make sure each one of these are working strategically at the same time for this whole process to work. So that's Amazon. So it's a kind of a B2C model. Second example, Giro, if people know, any bicyclists out there know the helmet company. They do a couple of things now, but originally helmet company. So what was their flywheel? So they started with product innovation, right? So they were focused on invent great products. Once they had a great product, they could focus on elite athletes, right? So they would go to the World Cup races and get elite athletes to use these helmets. I think actually Lance Armstrong was one of the original ones. But once they get the elite athletes using the helmets and televised and on camera, they could then focus on weekend warriors, right? So they would hit the regional races. They would then create awareness and use within the weekend warrior crew. Once you had weekend warriors, then you could go to mainstream consumers. So now they had a strong enough brand where mainstream customers were like, oh yes, I've seen this helmet company being used. Lots of folks. When I go out, I'm gonna buy this helmet because I've seen it on televised and on a lot of folks. With mainstream use, I build brand power, right? That gives me the ability to create brand power through use, which is valuable because it allows me to support a high cost or a high price. All right, I'm a differentiated product. I'm desirable, differentiated. I'm premium. People are willing to pay a premium for my product. Creates high prices, which are going to allow me to generate good profits, strong profits, which allows me to invest in product development. Right, I can innovate on products. Right, with those profits. That I've completed a turn in the flywheel. I can use these new great products, get elite athletes to use them. Right, and I can turn around the circle. Right. Again, each one of these steps keys into each other. If I don't do the weekend warrior crowd, I'm not going to get to the mainstream customer, right? Because it's the weekend warriors that ultimately get it in front of the consumer. Mainstream customers are not watching the Tour de France and the elite level programs at a level that's really going to drive mainstream adoption. It's going to be I'm driving around my local community and I see a whole bunch of weekend warriors out in a Peloton. And I see that half of them are wearing this kind of helmet. When I go to buy a helmet, that's what's going to drive that, right? So they've really dialed in. Each one of these steps is key to making this work. So financial services, Vanguard, if people know the Vanguard model. And actually, when I do this with clients, what I do is I give them I'll give them the flywheel with no name in it, and I make them guess what is the company. So you can kind of imagine doing this. In this case, Vanguard starts with low-cost mutual funds. So if anyone knows the boggleheads and the all the lure and the kind of following around Vanguard, their whole thing is low-cost mutual funds, right? They've optimized their portfolio of products to basically be indexed for the most part, but very, very low cost structures, right? So you're not going to lose money on fees. Low cost mutual funds is where they start. That allows them to deliver superior long-term returns, right? So by having low cost mutual funds, they have superior returns on a regular basis. That builds strong client loyalty, and for those in the financial services world, you know that Vanguard customers can be almost they can be a little crazy. Like they're very strong, loyal customers. But it builds that following, that customer following. By building loyalty, they're going to grow their assets under management, right? Their AUM, right? So by having assets under management, that generates economies of scale, right? I'm going to be able to have, with the same client base, with more assets under them, that's going to allow me to be very efficient on my economies of scale. That economy of scale allows me to even drive the cost down even farther on mutual funds, right? If anyone's really has done in business with Vanguard or knows Vanguard and see their stuff, they are relentless about driving costs out of their process. And there's stories of how people are driving Honda Civics and stuff like that just to kind of really, really, really keep their cost structure down, right? But you can see how this flywheel works, right? It's like if I have low-cost mutual funds, that's good returns, that builds loyalty, that increases my AUM, that is going to allow me to be more efficient, which is going to allow me to reduce my costs even more, right? So the idea here is that this is how Vanguard does it, right? A different financial services firm would have a different flywheel, right? Because they're not doing low-cost mutual funds, so they fundamentally have a different. Maybe it's really high customer service. Well, how does the flywheel work if you're customer service? That's what you want to figure out. What are your steps? All right, so I'm doing examples here because I think this is one of the best ways to really understand how the flywheel works, why it's important, how you construct one, and quite honestly, the simplicity of it. Sometimes I've seen flywheels where you get 15 different steps on here, and they're just they're too complicated. Sometimes they're too detailed, but a good flywheel is this 4, 5 to 7, 8 at the absolute most of it's like, oh, I get it. And by being able to describe it in these terms, everyone in the company can get it. And not only that, all your stakeholders can get it. So whether it's the investors or suppliers or partners, other people in the industry that you work with, like if they understand your flywheel, they can figure out, okay, how do I key into this and how can I help drive it? So how to construct your own flywheel. So those are some examples. How do you go about doing this? If you're interested in it, I'm going to walk through a couple of steps. It's certainly not difficult. What I would generally say is you may even create a couple versions to begin with, and you will need to kind of hone it over time, or you'll need to test it, go out, validate it by collecting information, talking with folks. But you really want to figure out like what are the key steps to your flywheel. So let's talk about how you do that. So I start with, and I'll explain how I do it with teams so that you can kind of figure out how you want to do it with your teams. But I break them into groups. I usually do at least 3 groups if I can, 2 groups if I don't know a few people, but at least 3 groups, sometimes 4. And the first thing I want them to do is create a list of, over the last 3 to 5 years, what have been some real successes of the business, right? So that's the first list I have them create. And these are projects, programs, clients, new initiatives, launches, like whatever things you've been doing as a business. What are some real successes you've had? So that's list 1. List 2, what are some of the non-successes you have? Like where have you had some failures, right? So what are the list of things that just didn't go so well, right? Either didn't deliver the ROI, was late on time frame, resources were a problem. But I want these 2 lists, right? I want at least 5 to 10 things on successes, 5 to 10 things on failures, and that's where I'm going to start. Once I have that list, then, as a group, I'm going to have each, and I'm going to have them work independently because I want them to each build a flywheel, and then we're going to compare. But I'm going to have them work independently. Then I say, okay, as a subgroup, brainstorm possible activities, and I'll give them the examples that I just gave you. But what are some of the activities that you do that you notice are common with the successes that we're missing in the failures? Right? And I want to, I'll generally start with, they'll come up with 10, 15 things that they do. You know, it could be around how you market, could be around how you build, how you create product, how you design things, how you acquire customers. Generally, these are going to be reasonably externally focused, although there's definitely times when there's an internal capability that is part of the flywheel. But I'll start with kind of external things, and we'll kind of fill them in with internal ones. But what are the things? What are the things that are common in successes and are not so common in failures? So we brainstorm a whole bunch, and I have them put them on stickies on the wall so they can kind of move them around easily. Once they have those lists, I want to winnow it down to 5 to 7, 5 to 8 key steps. What are the key steps that that are common in the successes that are not so common in the failures? And I want that cause and effect. I want to be able to test, and I want to have a logical relationship between A and B, where by doing more of A, what A produces is an input to B, right? So by creating great products, you know, that allows me to go to the elite athletes, and that the products that are created in that stage are things that I use to get them to wear. Right, so I want to have that relationship, and the reason I say that is sometimes it gets inverted. Some people think that, oh well, I've got these great relationship with athletes, and that allows me to get information to then create better products. Like it's the athlete insight that creates the product. I really want to test that. I want to validate. It's like, well, how did that really happen though? Did I come to them with a great product and they adopted it, or was it something? Was a conversation that I had? In which case, it actually is the reverse. In which case, it's, well, we build relationships with great athletes that give us insights to allow us to create great products. If that's the case, then I'd flip it around, right? So you really want to look at what is the practical relationship between these, and then finally, what I want to do is, once I've got that draft flywheel together within that subgroup, I want to test it against your successes and failures. So does it explain, or does it show? Does it demonstrate why we had a success in this case and why we had a failure in this case? And typically failures are, we tried to do something was either not within the wheelhouse, within our flywheel, or we failed to execute on one or more stages of the flywheel well. Right, so usually there's a misstep on one of the stages of the flywheel. So if Giro Helmets, failed to get the weekend warriors, and they went directly from elite athletes to the mainstream, I would say that in a particular product that didn't do so well, maybe they skipped a step, or maybe they weren't successful on a particular step, which caused the flywheel to not create momentum. All right, so once I have these two groups, they've got their draft flywheels, I bring them together, 2 or more groups. I have them put the flywheels on the wall, and I want to say what is similar and what is different. And usually, like half of them are pretty similar. It's like, oh, they've all got A and C and E, and they may have different kind of terms in between there, and they may have, maybe one has 8 steps and one has 7 steps, and they, okay, well, are those 2 really separate steps? Can we combine these things? But we start looking at what are the differences, and compare and contrast, and that's how we develop a draft. Now, I will say, once we've got a draft, we have to go out and validate. Usually it takes a couple of months. We'll review this over time. I usually work with companies quarterly, so it's, we'll do the draft one quarter, next quarter they'll go out and do some validation activities. We'll look at that validation, decide what we want to change or keep. And generally it stays the same, except for times like this, when we're going through, major changes in markets and business activities, so that it will shift at times. But generally it stays the same, or at least the elements of it will be consistent over time. So that's how you can work on your flywheel. So as I said, it's gonna have these kind of activities stitched together. Now, once I have a draft flywheel, one of the best ways to validate your flywheel is to look. So once I've got that, some questions you got. Sorry, I skipped ahead on a slide here. The things to ask yourself on your draft. One, is each step truly a separate activity? Meaning, sometimes what I see is, an activity that's sort of broken out into, C and D, say, but in reality, you would never do C without D. In that case, I would say you're really talking about one thing. We need to come up with a name that represents that one activity. So I want to validate it to make sure that I don't have sub activities, or I don't have this isn't a process flow. This is an activity that I could do or not do, but if it's part of my flywheel, I better do it. So that's combining any steps. Do I really need every step? So what I want to look for there is there a case of a success where one of the steps in the flywheel wasn't followed and it was still successful. And then I would say that isn't a core activity. I mean, it may have worked in it was part of that particular initiative, but I wouldn't say it's part of your flywheel. And then are any missing steps? And this is really testing the gap between two stages. Is there anything that happens between that is critical that we've missed? Like, can you really go from D to E? Is there anything that we would have to do to really make that jump, or is it a natural? Yeah, the output of D is really the input of E. And then sometimes I'll just look at labeling. What is this thing? They may have labeled it funny, and I'm looking for both. Something that is a realistic description of the activity, underlying activity, but I also need something that is going to communicate well, right? The part of the reason to do the flywheel is you're essentially communicating your core capabilities to the rest of the organization. And so there's a little bit of wordsmithing on this. Like I want something that's going to be effective, but also snappy and easy to communicate, right? I don't want a complicated, activity description. I want something that people should, if people are involved in strategy or you're, the key people inside the company should be able to sketch out the flywheel on command, right? They should know the flywheel well enough. They could write in the pieces to it. So that is how I sort of test or validate the strategy with a group. Oops, I keep doing that. There we go. So one of the best ways, once you have a draft flywheel, one of the best ways we can validate that is something through the hedgehog concept. So for those of you that are Jim Collins fans, you certainly know this, but hedgehog is something that he came up with, or he looked at or discovered inside highly successful companies, really combined three core, sort of the business that they were in checked three big boxes. And those boxes, the first one, is this something that you're really, really good at, that you're an expert in, right? So that's box one. If you can really say that, hey, we are world class. We are some of the best people in the world in this activity. That's box one. Two, is that thing that you do, is the thing that you provide, the product or service that you provide, is it valuable, right? Does it solve a need that people have that creates value, meaning they're willing to pay for it? Ideally, they're willing to pay a premium for. The third thing is passion. Is this something you love doing? Right? If you can check all three of these boxes, and a lot of times one of these boxes isn't checked, right? I can be an expert, and it can be super valuable, but if I'm not passionate about it, I'm not. It's going to be a chore, right? I'm not going to be super into it. If I'm passionate about it and it's super valuable, but I'm not an expert, like I'm not good at it. Like, yes, people want it, and yeah, I love doing it, but if I'm not good enough in it, people aren't going to want to buy it, right? Because it's not going to have the level of quality and insight that I need. And then finally, if I'm an expert and I'm passionate about it, but it's not super valuable, that's more of a hobby, right? That's like, hey, yeah, you're really good at it, you love doing it, but it's not that valuable in the world. You're not going to make money on it. It's not a business. It's more of a hobby. So by looking at these activities and saying, look, does it check the box? Is this something that I truly am really, really good at, that my company, as a company, we're really, really good at? Is it valuable to the world? Does it create, is it something people really want? Does it create value? Does it solve a real problem that people have? And then finally, passionate. Do we love doing it? Are these activities, if you look at any one of these activities and you kind of cringe, you're like, oh God, I hate doing that. Right? That's a warning sign, right? That's a flag for me. That's a red flag, because if you are not passionate about these activities, you're not going to create momentum. Like, in fact, momentum's going to be undesirable for you, right? Because if you think about, hey, I've got this flywheel, if I can get this thing going, I'm going to be double, tripling, quadrupling the amount of work on it. If I love this work, I'm going to be bringing it on. If activity C, you're just like, oh, I hate that. Like, why would I want to ramp up this flywheel, right? So I got to make sure that it's going to check all these boxes. If it doesn't check a box, I have to kind of take a step back and say, like, where do I want to be? Is there another flywheel, is another business, is another set of activities that is going to check the box here? Or what would I need to change about it to check the box, right? Do I need to adjust this or pivot this in some way that's going to be more successful? So I'm doing a lot of this work right now with folks as they're kind of coming out of this, the pandemic, and people, kind of reopening businesses. Markets are changed. Business models are changed, and we're doing a lot of what we need to adjust this flywheel to operate in this new context. We want to make sure that it still checks these three boxes. All right, so this flywheel is a great way to coordinate these things. So that's how we kind of validate it and make sure that we're on the right track. A couple of, so flywheel is the highest level, sort of simplest version of a system model, basically, for those that you are in system modeling. And it's a great way to just kind of describe the business in dynamic terms. You can actually take all of these activities, and each one of these activities can have smaller flywheels. In fact, I'll work with businesses that have kind of multiple lines of business, and we'll see, are there each line of business has a flywheel, and then these flywheels interconnect, and then we look at the ultimate business flywheel above them. But these are some common patterns. I came out of software, and I was an architect, so I'm a big believer in pattern thinking and pattern languages. These are some patterns that come up. The first place is marketplace. It's kind of what you saw in the Amazon, where you get sellers, it increases listings, that brings in buyers, that increases transactions, that brings in more sellers, right? So there's a natural positive reinforcement loop on that. Economies of scale. If I have large volume, I get better pricing, which reduces my overhead, which helps me reduce my my price to customers. Again, so there's economies of scale model here that we can play with. I put in one called AI, artificial intelligence flywheel, that I've seen on a lot of businesses now, which is by having insights bring in customers bring in use, basically data, and that data allows me to develop better insights. So I've seen a lot of businesses that are using this flywheel around by creating insights and bringing in customers. That gives us more data. We can create better insights, so they can really create this positive feedback loop. The freemium model, I put out free products. It gets me users. I get upgrades. That increases my paid users, that gives me profits, which I can then turn into more free products, right? So there's a freemium model here. There's a disposable model. So this is kind of the razor. I subsidize the handle, or I have a low-priced handle, which gets me customers. They then order replacement blades. It gives me profits, which then allows me to put out more handles, right? So there's patterns here that you can use inside this flywheel, pattern languages you can use inside the flywheel. And we'll often look at these and saying, is there a model here that we can leverage to build out a company's flywheel? These tend to be very powerful ones because they're kind of, they're known ways of building a momentum in a business. So you can look at those, and there's many more of these. You email me if you want other lists, but these are 5 examples. So those are some examples. Let's do another one with Nespresso. So people know this one is the coffee. They've kind of they've been quite popular both in the home with residential and commercial coffee machines. But if you look at how they did this, they started with product innovation design, right? So they created a new set of technology, both in the machine and in the pods, in terms of everything from how, what coffee they picked, how they ground the coffee, how they made the foils, how they packaged those foils to stay fresh, how they were able to create pressurized, steam inside the machine, like all these kind of things that went in product design. And they started with high-end venues and experiences, right? So if like people in New York, they started with this Nespresso cafe, which is essentially a high-end cafe, but it was pod service, not the big Italian, high pressured, steam espresso machines. It was these pods, right? So they were creating a high-end venue experience that got them into the office, right? So they started actually as an office system where they were they got these systems as an alternative to the basically coffee pot maker system. It was a single-use, high-quality espresso-like drink system that was easy for companies to buy and clean. That then allowed them to get into home coffee systems, right? So once you got into the office and they developed a beachhead there, they then were able to go into the home. But it was a very intentional high-end venue, office, home process. and that increased then the demand. Once they got into the home, it was a dramatic increase in the pods themselves, which then allowed them to generate profits from sales and licensing, which then has allowed them to go back up into product design, right? So each one of these steps, was a very intentional process. They had to work to actually make them, to kind of develop a strategy around them and execute them. And they couldn't do the home coffee systems until they had successfully executed on the office coffee systems, right? So there was an intentional, this will allow us to do this. The coffee system will introduce the system to folks, which then will allow me to sell into the home. We couldn't sell the home until we had exposure in the office, right? So you get the idea. So some common mistakes, challenges that I see. So the first one is aspirational flywheels. So the flywheel we'd like to have versus the flywheel we are. Typically, I'm working with companies who have existing businesses, right? So they've got a proven track record, they've got traction, they've got a product or service out in the market, and we can use that to figure out what their current flywheel has been. It may not be a perfect flywheel, there may be ways to improve it, but at least we can base it on real world data and real world experiences. If I'm working with earlier stage companies, I have this come up quite a bit where they're doing a business model canvas and they're kind of figuring out, hey, what would our flywheel be? But they don't really have a lot of traction yet. What we will do is come up with 3 to 5 candidate flywheels that we're going to validate. All right, so you can do it for an early stage company as kind of a future thinking, what would our flywheel be? But my suggestion is you come up with a couple of different versions that you're going to validate, right? Because that's where you run into problems, is where you pick one thinking, oh, well, this is my flywheel, but you don't have real world data to back it up. So the other problem I find is that, we go through an exercise and they come up with a flywheel and they say, oh, that's it, good to go, lock and load, we're done. And until you go out and actually validate, until you actually talk with some customers, work with folks to really make sure that this is in reality what is happening. Oftentimes you get stages wrong, you miss steps, you're combining steps too quickly. You got to go out and validate this to really make sure that you're on the right track. So validating is really important. A lot of times I see overly complicated flywheels, like people get very, we've got, a really sophisticated business and, our flywheel has 12 steps and each one of these is critical. It's just 99 times out of 100, it's not that complicated. In fact, the business is hard. It's hard, I would say, to build a business with a very complicated flywheel because it doesn't have that kind of natural momentum, that easy momentum to it. You can only focus on so many things, even with a lot of resources and a big team. And you've got to figure out how to build a flywheel. You've got to get your flywheel down to, that 5 to 7 number in order for you to effectively manage it. Another thing I find every now and again is just poor wording, labeling. It's like the activity's just, it's the right activity. They just haven't framed it. They haven't named it very well. And like I said, part of the flywheel power is that you can communicate it out to folks, everyone in the organization, partners, stakeholders. If you don't name these things well, it's going to be confusing to folks so they don't get it. Like, you should get the flywheel pretty intuitively. And then finally, just wrong order, wrong sequence. That you think it's kind of was giving the example of the helmet company. It's like, well, is it great products that allow me to have the conversation with cyclists, or is it the conversation with cyclists that get me the great products? And you really have to kind of dig into that and understand. And there may be a little bit of back and forth on it, but in the end, it should be pretty clear. I was like, oh, okay, no, really the flow is, we come up with a great product design and that's what drives adoption in the cycling community. So figuring that out can be important. So how do we use the flywheel? So spinning your flywheel, what I call it, spinning the flywheel. How to grow and scale once you have one. So once you have your flywheel, I'm just checking my chat to make sure. Yeah, I don't see any questions in chat. Once you have your flywheel, how to use it. So assuming that you validate your flywheel and you know that the design is right and you can assess the performance, that I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. We can look for areas of improvements, and then we can fuel your leading activity. Like, once you get your flywheel right, that top activity is where you're going to add resources, money, focus, attention to drive the momentum. That's what's going to trigger it. That's what's going to sort of juice the flywheel. How do we do that? So what I will do is, once we have a flywheel on the board and we know that, okay, this is that has 5 activities, we validated or we're validating the hedgehog around it, I'll actually come in and have people do put post-it notes, and I'm looking for letter grade A, B, C. How are we doing on these different activities, and how are we doing on our hedgehog? And usually there's some team discussion. I might have everyone write down a letter grade separately, and then kind of collect it and say, okay, well, what did everyone vote on as A? And you may say, oh, it's an A, it's a B, it's an A plus, and we'll come up with an agreed to score. So we'll score letter grade score each activity on the flywheel, and then what I'm looking for is a name. I want who's accountable, who's the single ringable neck for this activity inside the business. And two things happen sometimes, well, and they tend to be related. We will certainly see scores that aren't so good, right? You'll see an activity, it's a B minus, C plus, C. It's clearly not performing the way it really needs to perform. Oftentimes, if I've seen that, there's a very high correlation between that and multiple names on this sticky, right? Where there's a lack of clear accountability, clear focus of one person in the organization that's really focused on that activity. That is, I would say that's a 0.783 correlation between multiple names and low score. Just because you don't have anyone who's really, taking it on. No one really owns it, right? So the first thing I'm looking for is how are we doing on any one of these grades? And then I'm looking at the names, all right? And so sometimes I'll look at the names and I'll have the people validate themselves or score themselves on it. It kind of depends on the group what's going on, but this can be a really powerful exercise. And we'll do this on a quarterly basis. Like we'll put the flywheel back up and we'll just how are we doing in the last 90 days on our flywheel? And what I want to see is is there anything that is not working well that we really need to shore up? And B, did anything change, right? Is there anything, it's hey, well, we were an A plus last time. Why are we a C? What's happened here? So I want to diagnose the situation using flywheel. This is one of the most powerful uses of a flywheel is as a diagnostic tool for what's going on inside the company. Some other things we can do with measurement. So each one of these activities, we can start building executive dashboards around. So we can build KPIs around, well, what's the KPI between A and B? What's the KPI between B and C, et cetera, right? And I can actually build a key performance indicator, a metric that I look at least on a weekly basis, so that I can kind of keep track of how my flywheel is doing. So I grab Jiro here, I put in here, it's well, the indicator of great products to elite athletes is what percentage of the tour, of the Pro Tour is using our helmets? What percentage of the regional races do we see using the helmets? What do the retail stores look like? What do the product reviews look like, right? That's gonna tell us if our mainstream users are building brand power or not. Gross margin is going to tell us if we've got good profits, right? Are we able to create a good gross margin on our brand power? And then, how many patents are we producing per month or, per period, right? So these are all metrics that you can put in place to start using your flywheel to build executive dashboards. I feel like the executive dashboards, we could do a whole nother session on that. But is one of the more powerful or most important part of managing a growth situation inside of a company, because we need to keep these things working. Without these metrics, we're not going to have the early telltale signs that we may have a problem in our flywheel. We'll only know after the fact at the end of a quarter when performance is poor, and we go back and measure these kind of metrics will allow us to catch this stuff very, very quickly. So it can be a great tool. So how do we apply the flywheel? So I mentioned that diagnosing the business, a really powerful tool. You build a good flywheel, or you model your flywheel well. It's a great tool for diagnosing how your business is performing. You can also look at, well, how should you functionally design the organization? So I will often do a flywheel, and that will drive the organizational design. So how the departments are set up, how they're focused, how they interact, leadership on those roles, how the leadership team is actually structured. Because I want a very strong synergy of the business design, the business structure, the business organization to the flywheel. We can develop, I mentioned the executive dashboard, so it can be a tool to create how do we measure the performance of the business, what kind of metrics do we want to put on the dashboard. We can actually use this to find new pivots and expansions. So if we see an opportunity to pivot or to expand the business, what we want to do is figure out, well, how can we leverage our flywheel in this new area, in this new geography, and this new product line? Jiro could easily go out into an adjacent space, adjacent product space, use that same process to build out a flywheel. Not all adjacent spaces are going to lend themselves to that flywheel very well. I would choose the spaces that they can apply that flywheel very directly, right? So they maybe other cycling apparel or cycling accessories they could do it in, but should they get into bikes? I don't know. All right, like I'd have to look at their flywheel and sort of see, is this work? Does this not work? And then finally, evaluating acquisitions and joint ventures, where I've worked with a lot of groups when we're doing expansion through acquisition. The flywheel can become a great tool to just evaluate, well, how is this other business run? What is their flywheel? And does it harmonize with our flywheel or not? And if it harmonizes, it's a great opportunity, right? Because we can bring these flywheels together and they're reinforcing each other positively. If not, then if we're going to do this deal, we need to keep this at arm's length, right? We do not want these flywheels clashing into each other, right? And so really understanding the flywheels and what drives these businesses, whether it's a formal acquisition or a joint venture partnership, like really knowing how these work and where they're synergistic and where they're not is going to give you a lot of insight into, should we do the deal? Should we not do the deal? If we're going to do the deal, how we should set it up, and should we keep these as separate business units, or should we combine them? So that's this is using your flywheel once you've figured it out. So where do you go from here? I'm going to wrap up, and then I'm going to see if there are any questions. If you have any questions, throw it in the chat. The sort of suggestion, or like how I typically do it, putting a team together, I usually use the senior leadership team. It may involve some of the subject matter experts within the company as well, but just people who you feel are in touch with really what drives the company, who have some insight in what drives the company. I like to read through the monograph. I give people the monograph. It takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes is kind of a pre-work to the session. Like I said, I break into a couple of teams, 2 to 3 teams at a minimum, and they each create their own flywheel, and then we want to compare and combine. So what is similar across them? What's different? How do we negotiate the differences? But I want to bring them into a common flywheel, and then I want to assess and find those key action items. Like once I have looked at their flywheels, boil it down to those key action items, and then figure out, how do I want to validate? What am I confident on? What am I not confident on? How can I collect data to reaffirm that the fact that this is the right flywheel for us? So these are some of the resources. These are articles I write for Inc. I have the 2 podcasts, and then a bunch of stuff on my blog. I do a bunch of CEO roundtables right now. These have been really helpful for folks. If you're interested, that's the link to those. I'm running 3 sessions for free for folks just to kind of help them, and we're using some flywheel concepts in some of these roundtables. Some of the other coaching programs I do, and my contact information. So if anyone has any questions on anything from today, or they want to try the flywheel and they want to get some feedback on it, I'd be happy to review things. Send me a photograph or a screen grab of what you're creating. I'm happy to give you feedback. My website, my email address. Hopefully that was helpful. The flywheel is one of the really interesting kind of fun things that I do. So hopefully people found some help in there. And I'm just double checking.
Yeah, I think, Bruce, we have one question in the queue.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
I don't see it in front of me. I don't know where.
Okay.
Can you read it to me? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a small business launching a brand new product, plus there's no meaningful data yet, would you recommend going through a business canvas exercise first before doing would you recommend going through a business canvas exercise first before defining the flywheel?
Yeah, so I would do a BMC, a business model canvas first, because that's really where you're going to postulate the business model that you're trying to implement. The flywheel is going to be, how do you grow and create momentum in that business model over time? And while you can have 2 different companies that have more or less the same underlying business model, they might have 2 very different flywheels. So the flywheel is really how you create momentum inside the business model. The business model is kind of the basic, okay, here's the segment, here's our value proposition, here's our supply chain. It's going to look at how the underlying thing is structured. Again, for earlier stage, you're probably going to be developing a couple of different possible flywheels, and then validating them over time. So at early stage, you're not going to have, most likely you're not going to have a working flywheel at that point. It's something you're kind of driving towards. So hopefully that's helpful. Any other questions?
No, that was the only question. I guess for me, I just had one follow-up question. You kind of talked about when's an appropriate time to do this exercise? You mentioned, what were some successes or failures for the past 3 to 5 years? Do you have to have that much time as a business underneath your belt to really go through this exercise properly, or can businesses do it more quickly? I guess there may not be a definitive answer, but just from your experience, when do people typically, construct a definitive flywheel?
So I will, so flywheel is part of my core strategy stack, meaning that I would, when I sit down and work with a company, whether they're earlier stage or they're later stage, and we're just trying to figure out how to scale, it is something that I would ask as part of the core sort of differentiation strategy structure that I use, right? So I've got about 13 things that I go through with a company to figure out, build a comprehensive strategy and a roadmap. Flywheel is part of that. So I would always do it. It's just, you do it for different reasons depending on the where a company is in terms of, if it's really early, it's more of a what are the possible flywheels we could build, and how do we go to market with validating a couple of them, and finding one that is really going to drive success. If it's an existing company that has had some level of success, I want to sort through the successes and failures to figure out, okay, what is the flywheel that's working, and how do we reinforce that, and how do we double down on that, rather than, typically what's happening, it's kind of lopsided and wobbly and not spinning very well. But if we can figure out what it is, and we can, even it up and then start driving a momentum, we'll see significant uptick on performance of the business.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining. I appreciate it. Like I said, this is my contact information if anyone has any follow-up questions. But yeah, this is a fun one. I love flywheel. It can be like, you get it right, there's also this kind of like, there's a satisfying kind of epiphany. It's like, oh, we got it. And then you start driving it, and it's fun to see it work.
That's awesome, Bruce. Yeah, really appreciate your time. As always, really, I think unique insights. And, I went to business school, but I've never heard of a flywheel.
Yeah.
And, it's definitely just everything, different things work for different people, but I think that this is a great exercise and something that people should consider. So I appreciate your time, Bruce.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.